Oh my god, hey, welcome back, or if you're meeting me today for the first time, hello, my name is Mickey Jo and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I'm a professional theatre critic and a content creator here on social media. You may be watching this on my theatre-themed YouTube channel, or you may be listening to this in podcast form. Hello to you. Like I said, I am a professional independent theatre critic and I review plays and musicals that I've been invited to go and see in London's West End as well as worldwide. And today I'm going to be talking all about the West End transfer of the Donmar Warehouse production of Next to Normal. Lots to say about this show. I reviewed it last year at the Donmar Warehouse, but as we've seen before with productions like Oklahoma, which ran at the Young Vic in London after transferring from Broadway, and then also transferred to the Wyndham's Theatre where Next to Normal is playing, the productions themselves, as well as my relationship to the productions, can vary and evolve and change. And that is very much the case here because I do feel a little bit differently about Next to Normal now that it's made its way to the West End. So today I'm going to be letting you know exactly what I thought of this show, of all of these performances, and a little bit of background about the piece as well, for those of you who know nothing about Next to Normal. I am going to be covering a little bit of spoiler territory here, but I'll do my best to let you know where that is coming, because there are still parts of this review that you can watch or listen to without finding out what happens in the show. And there are some hefty spoilers in this one that I would encourage you not to find out about before seeing the show for the first time. Now, if you have already seen this production, either at the Donmar Warehouse or already in the West End, let me know your thoughts and feelings about it down below. And if you've seen a previous production of Next to Normal, maybe you saw the original Broadway or off-Broadway run, maybe you've seen one of the many US regional productions, or that revival they did in Barcelona with Alice Ripley that was like semi-immersive not too long ago, let me know about those as well, because I'm fascinated. If you enjoy this video, then make sure to follow me or subscribe wherever you are seeing or hearing this video, and you can also go find me on other social media platforms. I am on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, and I am on the app formerly known as Twitter. You can find me on all of those at MickeyJoTheatre. For now though, let's talk about Next to Normal in the West End. So for those of you who do not know anything about this show, Next to Normal is a edgy rock musical with music by Tom Kitt and book and lyrics by Brian Yorkey. It made its way to Broadway in the late 2000s, but it had been in development for much longer than that, and seems to have been inspired by the 90s rock musicals like Rent, also a little bit by shows like The Who's Tommy. Certainly there's a lot to be said for the way that both of those shows and this then subsequently utilize kind of the timbre and the tone of rock and roll music to articulate the emotional intensity of their themes. Because this came to Broadway not only in the wake of a changing musical style in the years before Hamilton, when we were starting to hear a little bit more rock and roll, stuff that started, I guess, with Jesus Christ Superstar, with Hair, with The Who's Tommy, with those other kind of pioneering rock musicals, and then became popularized even more with shows like Rent, with shows like Spring Awakening in a slightly more edgy way. But it also represents a shift towards shows with a lot more emotional honesty, talking about themes such as mental health, such as the complexity around medicating mental health, which is much of what Next to Normal is about, talking about difficult and perhaps toxic and very damaged family relationships, stuff that had been explored in plays like Long Day's Journey into Night, like a lot of Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller fare for a very long time, but concepts that had taken longer to permeate into the world of musical theatre. For context, The Musical Company was considered to be a little bit too emotionally honest when that premiered in the 1970s. Skip forward to a show like Next to Normal, and those same 70s audiences would have been having heart attacks in the orchestra. Now, the show follows a suburban American family named the Goodmans, who we learn immediately are ever so slightly dysfunctional, but only as much as your average cartoon sitcom family. The show's early tone has previously been described as a hybrid between Long Day's Journey into Night and Family Guy, which I think is such an accurate description. I think we often think about Next to Normal as being about the matriarch of that family, Diana Goodman, and the treatment of her mental health, but I think what this production in particular highlights very well, and I'm already getting ahead of myself in reviewing it here, is the duality between her journey and the journey of her daughter Natalie, and, you know, what they have in common, what they do differently, and the two roads that they are both navigating that alternately fork and intertwine. The show was hugely well received on Broadway. It didn't win the Tony Award for Best New Musical because Billy Elliot transferred over there and won it. Sorry, Americans, for that one. I actually think Next to Normal maybe should have taken it, but that's a controversial conversation for another time. What Next to Normal did win, just like A Stranger Loop, which I'm currently representing on my t-shirt here, is the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, which is sort of an even more coveted award for musicals because it doesn't often go to musicals. Shows like Hamilton, A Chorus Line, Sunday in the Park with George, which also didn't win the Tony, as well as one of the show's inspirations, Jonathan Larson's Rent, are all previous recipients of the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. And I do think that's very well deserved, because I think Next to Normal represents one of the stepping stones in the history of the evolution of musical theatre as an art form. It wasn't as wide-reaching a cultural phenomenon as something like Rent, as something like Hamilton. No, those are the really big turning points because they had so much impact that they caused so many ripples within the musical theatre lake. I guess this metaphor's got away from me slightly, but Next to Normal is very much one of those key shows over the last 30 years that has changed the face of contemporary musical theatre and how we tell stories and what we tell stories about. Without a Next to Normal, would we have a show like A Dear Evan Hansen? And in fact, for all of the marketing around that musical that purports it to be this thing that destigmatizes mental health, Next to Normal was having much harder conversations around that topic years previously, and still does, but this time in London. So post-Broadway, we, and myself included, were waiting years for Next to Normal to make its way to the UK, and for whatever reason, we now understand that it's to do with rights being held by different organisations who, for whatever maddening reason, were reluctant to actually stage the thing. We had to wait 15 years for Michael Longhurst, artistic director of the Donmar Warehouse, who has just left the Donmar Warehouse actually, to programme it at that small London venue. And he created a production sort of dictated by that theatre and its capabilities. It's a very intimate space with the audience wrapped around three sides of the stage on two levels. And so contrary to this bold, brash, blasting thing that it had been on Broadway, it became intimate and inviting, and the tone of the piece had to shift necessarily because of the different playing space, something that Michael Longhurst, who has directed in a handful of different houses, understood very well. And if you return to my previous review, I enjoyed the production, but I think I was still in many ways coming to terms with the differences between what I'd been expecting based on that original Broadway version of the show and the version that we were now getting in London, as well as a handful of little direction ideas that I didn't necessarily understand, really. But that wouldn't be the end of this production story, because it has just transferred to the Wyndham's Theatre in the West End, where I had the chance to go and see it again. So let me tell you what I now think of this production. Now, I sort of anticipated this, if only because I enjoyed that Oklahoma revival so much more in the Wyndham's versus at the Young Vic, and I'm all for immersive theatre, and I know a lot of people really love that, and I enjoy a version of immersive, and I enjoy things that I would characterize as atmospheric and engaging, but my preference, and I think this is just the way that I've been trained by seeing so much theatre in my lifetime, is always to sit back and watch something happening in a goldfish bowl. You know, with Oklahoma at the Young Vic, we were there amongst the chaos of it all, and at the Wyndham's, we were watching this very strange thing unfolding, sort of like in a zoo exhibit, basically. And Next to Normal has had a similar shift, I would say. And I was sat there last week desperately trying to remember what any of my problems were with this revival, because I love it now. I do. I think in many ways Michael Longhurst's direction here is a lot more smart and sophisticated than I gave it credit for. I think the act of having relocated it to a larger stage invites a lot of the sort of turned up volumes that I wanted. I wanted Caissie's performance to be a little bit more manic in the early moments of the show, and you definitely get that in this production because she's having to play to a much larger space, and she as well knows the difference between playing those big houses and those small spaces. She's done giant Broadway theatre, she's played the St. James, for crying out loud. Where you get the best of both worlds, Hannah Montana style, is they did all of that work to find the intimacy and to find the detail and the depth and the nuance at the Donmar Warehouse, and so, you know, they can just explore and amplify the moments that need to be bigger and broader, but they still have the detail and the depth from that previous run. I want to talk a lot about the set design because I think this was one of my biggest sticking points at the Donmar. I just didn't get it, honestly. I did not understand this particular aesthetic for the show. I said I think it looks like an IKEA showroom, whereas the original Broadway production had that quality where we're sort of seeing the house very subverted. It didn't look like a domestic setting. It looked like a rock and roll concert, and that's at points throughout the show the way that Diana experiences the world. We see that literally happening when she goes for a meeting with a new psychotherapist and she experiences him singing to her like a intimidating rock star, even though he's just speaking. So the Broadway production leaned into the idea of making everything bright and scaffolding and metallic, and it's a set design that we've seen a lot since on Broadway. But at the Donmar, and now in the West End, Chloe Lamford's set design, like I said, it looks kind of like an IKEA showroom, but a very expensive IKEA showroom, sort of like a home that you might see on the British TV programme Grand Designs, if that means anything to you. It was very modern, very sleek, and it just looks like an ordinary, very contemporary, quite upmarket, upper middle class house, basically. And this is a choice that goes completely in the other direction of setting it in a very traditional, very everyday setting to allow them to look like the perfect loving family that they introduced themselves as at the beginning, and everything that's happening within that gets to kind of juxtapose that idea. Except it's even more clever than that, because Michael Longhurst recently spoke about the design for the show and the idea of it representing a brain. And you see the band on stage, they're occasionally visible, parts of them are occasionally concealed, but they exist in these 4 different compartments, I think there's 4, at the top of the set on this split level thing, and they occasionally light up in different colours, but they are meant to represent the different parts of Diana's brain. And I even think that the diagonal staircase coming down from the centre off to one side is meant to continue that idea of looking at, you know, like one hemisphere of the brain from the side. And I was starting to look at this production going, oh my gosh, this is so much smarter than I gave it credit for. And the particular locations where different people appear in those rooms on that upper level has a meaning about, you know, invoking the idea of memory and invoking a whole lot of different things. Again, I'm trying to stay away from spoilers just for now, but that is used to particularly clever effect in the second act. I also think just having the band on stage is a decision that I've warmed to as well, because it toys with that thing that the Broadway production was doing of, you know, really giving meaning to the score and the reason for which this show is musicalized and the way that Diana experiences the world with this manic musical rocky quality. It's almost as if that music, the lens through which she experiences the world, is something that is like stuck in their attic. It's like present in their house and she can't get rid of it. I also think there's just a logistical difference here, where at the Donmar, half of the audience was sat on that upper level in line with the band looking down on everything, and here it very much feels like the playing space is the house and the band are just up and behind that, so it just everything sits a little bit differently. There are projections that don't feel as much of a focal point as they were at the Donmar. They're just sort of providing a little bit of depth and context at the back rather than being as obvious. All of this before we begin to talk about the new depths and exciting discoveries of the actors in this cast, who are all giving remarkably good performances. But before I talk about them, I do want to heap an enormous amount of praise on Michael Longhurst as well as Anne Yee, who provided additional direction as well as movement and choreography, because I think it all sort of unlocked to me a lot more on this repeat viewing of the show, and it also had the benefit of managed expectations because I knew to expect differences this time around, which I think is always helpful. But it's the subtle work of it all, and it's the sensitivity with which the thing has been brought to the stage. It's considerably less brash than I think that first production of Next to Normal was, for its own reasons. I think it's a little bit more heartfelt. It's less sort of operatic in its emotional scale. It feels more honest. It feels more intimate. It feels more genuine and authentic and real. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about the cast yet, but the casting, I need to tell you who this casting director was because they deserve awards. Let me tell you. Anna Cooper was the casting director for this project. Now, Caissie Levy famously was cast by Michael Longhurst, who had just worked with her on Caroline or Change on Broadway via a DM. He had the rights to the show and he was like, you'd break our hearts with this, come and do this show in London. She was more than happy to say yes, but the way it's been cast around her, they feel like such a believable family unit. They look like they could be related. There are moments at the end of this show where Caissie and Eleanor are together on stage having this sort of fraught mother-daughter interaction with the difficulty of Natalie's entire lifetime dying on their lips as they try and explain what they need from each other and what they haven't been able to give and take from each other throughout all of this time. And they look so similar. You so buy that Eleanor is playing a character who could very easily turn into Caissie's character completely because they look like mother and daughter in that moment. And there are pitfalls that we often fall into with casting for the stage, where the kids look too old, where the parents look too middle-aged. I think this production much more so than the original allows you to connect to the younger versions of themselves who maybe had children too soon. There's a lyric that both Diana and her husband Dan sing in the second act where they say, "I was a child raising a child." You really feel that in this one. Now, I would like to share with you a few more details about why I really love this production, but to do that, I think I'm going to have to talk about some spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers, this is probably as much of this review as you're going to be able to watch, because it's also going to come up in the section where I talk about the performances. Go buy a ticket to the show, come back to me when you've seen it. So I want to talk a little bit about this material and the brilliance of it. I've already kind of touched on how smart it is tonally to combine this musical style with the story that they're telling. That gets hammered home even more in the second act when Diana has electroconvulsive therapy, basically shock therapy, which I think was one of the earlier ideas of the show, that in a previous iteration before it was Next to Normal was actually called Feeling Electric. And obviously if you're going to musicalize the sensation of experiencing therapy like that, you're going to do it with rock and roll. I will say it sounds absolutely fantastic in this production. Credit to Nick Barstow, who is the musical director, as well as Nigel Lilly, who is the music supervisor for this production. And there's real genius, I think, in this score and in this material. The way that it balances everything at the beginning. I mean, the first song alone, I could spend half an hour talking to you about why Just Another Day is so clever, everything that it foreshadows. So much of the show, it tells you what's going to happen in those first few lines, and everything that everyone is saying is deeply loaded, and the way that they interact with each other, and the way it allows the audience, those who don't know what's coming, to see one version of reality that makes sense without realizing what they're actually looking at. It's brilliantly clever. The big spoiler of the show, which I am warning people about for one last time before I tell you, is that Diana's son, with whom she interacts at the very beginning of the piece, is not actually there. He is a tactile hallucination that she is seeing, despite the fact that he died as a very young child. This being a traumatic episode from her past and a huge source of enduring grief that has exacerbated the mental health symptoms that she experiences, such as hallucinations. And there's such a richness of her material, because we've seen so many characters on stage who are simply afflicted by adverse mental health, and Diana is an entire fascinating and multifaceted human being who happens to have a handful of symptoms and who has been diagnosed in such a way before and is seeing hallucinatory visions of her son that she comes to remember aren't real, but she feels comforted by nonetheless, and she is aware that she should be forging a relationship with her daughter, and she has this hot and cold marriage with her husband, but she is fiery and she is passionate and she is desperate and frustrated and terrified, and an entire human being created on stage. We don't often get to see this level of detail in one person, and we don't often get to explore these kinds of family dynamics with such humor. Like we see it in a lot of, like I said, like Eugene O'Neill plays, we see that kind of generational resentment that we see from Natalie and her inheriting a lot of sort of negative behavior traits from both of her parents, I think. But this show navigates it with a deliberately bleak humor that it feeds the audience with one hand so that it can devastatingly punch them with the other unexpectedly. Moments like, and I'm going to come back to the direction here, because I Dreamed a Dance is a harrowing piece of musical theatre. This takes place when Diana is, with the encouragement of her psychotherapist, going through the childhood possessions of her late son in order to try and process this grief and move on, during which time we see a hallucination of him. In the original Broadway production, he appeared in a suit and danced with her. I don't know if it was invoking like prom or whatever. In this production, he walks down from her music mind upstairs, and he has a backpack, and it's invoking the idea of him running away from home, or him being forced to leave home, and him being evicted, which is what's happening in that moment, which I think is all the more difficult for her to endure, and I think is very much, with the grief and the guilt that she is experiencing from that, exactly how she would see him. That's what she feels like she's doing to him by trying to move on from all of this. She's trying to forget him and push him away, and she can't bring herself to do that. And what we hear but don't see, which is incredibly clever, is that this has triggered a failed suicide attempt, and the dance that she does with her son is tantamount to that process. His arc in the show is also fascinating because he comes to represent something of a malevolent force, and particularly so in that moment, but we find a way through that, and we come to understand that it's just his perceived frustration and desperation for life, which again we hear about in the lyrics of that first number. He talks about another stolen hour where the world will feel my power and obey. We see the influence that he has over his mother. And not just that, because, and this is the second major spoiler of the production, in the final moments we find out, after Diana has left and decided to go and pursue life on her own terms independently, that Dan can also see visions of his dead son, and possibly has been able to this entire time, but has been dealing with it very differently, and he doesn't want to, and he is grappling with the grief of this, and we see him, and this is absolutely devastating to watch, turn to him and say his name for the first time in the show and call him Gabriel, and it's a gut punch of a moment in the theatre because it brings even more life to him, and it brings even more reality to this difficult thing that they've experienced. You know, we are seeing him as a character on stage as much as they are, so we are positioned to be able to feel that very acutely. And while everyone in Diana's life has been telling her that he's not there, including her husband, who possibly has been able to see him as well this entire time because he's been navigating that same grief but repressing it, we are experiencing him and seeing him alongside her, so we are right in there. The production offers a lot of incredibly striking visual moments. One of the most bold things that it does is while Diana is trying to clear out this box, and as we hear about the suicide attempt that occurred, a pool of blood emerges from underneath the box, sort of toying with the metaphorical idea of what that task represented. This, I think, was more intense at the Donmar Warehouse because almost everyone in the audience could see it, and here, if you're sat in the stalls, it's not immediately obvious, but you get that second punch moment when Jamie as Dan goes to mop it all up and takes these towels and then lifts up the towels, and they are clearly soaked with blood. If you're someone who struggles with blood, then the song I Dreamed a Dance is your warning light that this is coming within the next few minutes, and in the song that follows, that's when Jamie is mopping up all the blood. They also make very clever use of the revolve, and you have this very geometric, very end-on set that is very regular, and there are moments where everything starts to spin out of control and starts to be put off kilter, but all of this is ultimately a foundation for the most important thing in this show, which is the character work. So let me tell you about these incredible performances. So Caissie Levy leads this production as Diana Goodman, and like I was saying before, I think she is such a real person in this role. It doesn't feel contrived, it doesn't feel theatricalized, it feels like she is at the height of every single emotion she could be experiencing while still being grounded in reality, which means we believe it, which means we can understand it, and which means, you know, it's even more harrowing and devastating and hard to watch. And she clearly has this crystallizing understanding of the show's tone because she plays the comedy and she plays the early flirtations jokingly with her doctor, and those first few scenes are so perfectly pitched before we get the revelation with the birthday cake and everything that follows thereafter that just destabilizes her a little bit. She does such a good job of portraying Diana as the audience understands her, and she's thinking about what we're seeing and how much we know during every stage of that, it seems. Either that or the creative team have thought about it enough to free her to be able to play something a little bit more genuine, but it's a fantastic performance, and it's the depth and the reality that I think made this the best leading lady stage performance that I saw last year. I know Nicole Scherzinger's performance in Sunset Boulevard was bold and huge and fantastic in a whole host of other ways, but no one attained the subtlety and the detail and the truth that I think Caissie Levy found in Diana. Now, she's also known for being an incredible vocalist. She's a Wicked alumnus, for crying out loud, and she gives you fantastic, edgy, powerful, belting vocals in this show. I think the strongest moment is probably I Miss the Mountains, and this is a fascinating song anyway, because at the beginning of the thing she is medicated and she is noticing that she's not experiencing parts of her life because her emotions are all suppressed, with a sort of a vague, dispassionate haze that her doctor describes as stable and potentially the ideal outcome. And over the course of this song, as it builds musically to a climax, she allows herself to feel more and more emotion, coming to the decision that she is going to throw these pills away so that she can feel things again, so that she can be a real human being and live her life. And something that Caissie Levy does better than almost anyone else I think I've ever seen on stage is she brings so much of that emotion to her vocal performance. You can hear the passion and the despair and the longing in her vocals while still being incredibly cleanly sung. Like, it's not just a technically impressive vocal, there is so much depth poured into it. Finally, something occurred to me about the ending of the show, which is that Diana, after she receives the electric therapy and finds out that her family weren't truthful with her about the extents of events that happened in their past, and she begins to come to terms with this for herself, she has this turning point where we can tell that she has become a little more self-sufficient, that she has the possibility to really take care of herself in a way the audience might not have trusted her to at the beginning of the show. And Caissie plays this crystallizing sort of moment of revelation with a lot of clarity, so that without really talking about it too much in the material, we instinctively get the sense that she might be okay here. It's still like nothing is confirmed, but it allows us to feel as though she's making the right decision for her, because I think if the mania were to linger a little too much, that it would feel like we wouldn't be able to get on board with that. Now, Caissie is joined on stage by Jamie Parker, who plays her partner Dan Goodman, giving just a wonderful acting performance. I think Jamie Parker is really one of the best leading men that we have in British theatre at the moment. And it's the hope and the optimism that kills you with his performance, because he is balancing an awareness of what is going on with her with this fantasy that it can still be suddenly improved and that they can go back to being this ideal, perfect family unit. It's that hope that prompts him to ignore medical advice and not tell her about the events of their past in the show's second act, because he is trying to build something even better than they had before. He's under the illusion that that's the best thing for her. When this blows up in his face, however, and they have a confrontation about their late son, he has this entire panic attack, which is played in real time on stage, and we see him lingering on stage in this fetal position, slumped down by the side of a kitchen counter, spinning around hopelessly as several other scenes are played around him, as the other members of his family find strength and find clarity and have conversations they haven't been able to have before. He is at his lowest, slumped down. It's devastatingly hard to watch, but played agonizingly well by Jamie Parker, and he takes his lead from Caissie in very fascinating ways, because she is a lot more forthcoming, because, you know, she's the way that she's been treated by the family and the way that she is positioned as the one who needs help. She is a lot faster to explain herself emotionally, but when she offers these things, he at multiple points throughout the show retaliates with that same emotional intensity and suggests to her that he's feeling the same things. When they both sing "I Was a Child, Raising a Child," and she forces this emotional confession out of him where he acknowledges the pain of their past, something that we then see later on when he notices and acknowledges and names Gabriel. It's brilliantly well done, and the rapport between the two of them that is tender and combative and, you know, evidences this lost love that they had, upon which is piled too much grief and challenge. It's one of the key components to why the show works so well. Then you have the younger generation of performers. Their children played by Eleanor Worthington Cox, who plays high achiever Natalie, as well as Gabriel, played by Jack Wolfe, who of course by this point we know is not really there. He is a tactile hallucination. And these two perfectly complete this fantastic quartet of performances. They're two of the most exciting rising stars of musical theatre, I think. Eleanor Worthington Cox, such a formidable actress. She was one of the first actresses to play Matilda, and I think the youngest Olivier Award winner in the history of British theatre. After that, she did a lot of television work, she did a lot of dramatic theatre. I've seen her on stage in To Kill a Mockingbird and in Jerusalem, but she's returned to musical theatre. She did The Secret Life of Bees last year at the Almeida, and now Next to Normal. And it's the performance of an incredibly capable actress that she is giving here. And just like Caissie, she understands the balance of this dark comedy with the emotional intensity of everything that she's playing. She has this romance with Jack Officio's character Henry, who's a little less nuanced and has a little less depth than everyone else. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think, you know, he has fewer emotions to play because he's not dealing with as much emotional complexity. He just likes Natalie. He, you know, he has an attraction to her and he wants to be able to help her and he wants to, you know, be a support for her. But it's Natalie's spiral into more destructive habits and recreational drug use that complete this mirroring within the show. It's not just a show about Diana, it becomes a show about the two of them being reflections of each other, and it's how Natalie responds to this domestic situation that makes the show more interesting. And Eleanor's performance is like an open vein. It is so raw, it is so alive, everything is there on her face, this wide-eyed, vocal fried, tearing her hair out thing that she does. It is so riddled with anxiety and stress. And again, vocally, such a fantastic voice that has this palpable pain in it that pours so much emotion into everything that she's singing. Finally, Jack Wolfe as Gabe, who's giving this gripping, fascinating, adaptive performance wherein he means something to different members of the family, and we principally understand throughout the thing that he's being perceived by his mother, but the way that he taunts his sister, the way that he appears, the moments when he's given a microphone, very cleverly staged, and he uses all of these tools from the creative team in the way that they bring him into the space to become this haunting presence. And it's much more complex than the idea of him just representing one thing. You know, we are asking ourselves questions about, is he malevolent? Is he trying to protect and advocate for his mother? Is he a really negative force? Is he just based on her own perceptions? Does he exist with any of his own kind of will and motivation? We see that desperation of him clinging to life. We see that sorrow after he's been burned out of her brain, when the image of him and just this silhouette of him is beginning to come back to her. But he does have, as many other critics have pointed out, this sort of Shakespearean puckish, impish quality. He feels like this spirit existing, and he goes from surly adolescent to a sort of a fallen angel. I absolutely don't think I'm really doing the depth of his performance justice with the adjectives that are coming to me, but it's really fantastic what he does on that stage. I do think how youthful both he and Eleanor come across in this production is very much a winning attribute of their casting, and we also have to talk about his vocals because, oh my goodness, I'm Alive is one of the standout moments of this production because of the way that he sings it and the fluidity with which he navigates this vocal. And it is belted out with a volume and a power that betrays his intensity and his desperation to live and his, you know, determination in that moment. But at the same time, it's this really beautiful bel canto tone and the fluidity of the riffs that he's adding to the thing. It's a very nimble sort of a vocal that feels light-footed, and it feels sort of haunting, sort of ghostly in a way. While we're talking about vocals, the last cast member on stage is Trevor Dion Nicholas, who plays two of Diana's different doctors. As one of these characters, we see him transforming into this rock and roll persona, but it's his spoken dialogue that I think is his best work in this production. And he becomes a grounding force at exactly the moment we need it, where we see Dan beginning to spiral a little bit more, when Natalie has already gone completely off the rails and everything else is just descending into complete chaos, really. And Trevor's concern and fear for Diana's well-being becomes the barometer by which we grow more and more tense in this situation. Honestly, it's just an impeccable cast in a really terrific production that I feel as though I can't do much more justice to in description. I implore you to go and see it, but with a production with such heavy and difficult psychological themes, please do go and look at all of the trigger warnings and content advisories before you do so. Like I've said before, if you've seen this production already, either at the Donmar or at the Wyndhams or another production of Next to Normal, comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings about the show, but try to keep those comments spoiler free as well for people who don't know the twists yet. Thank you so much for taking the time to engage with this review. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you are watching me here on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you find out about all of my upcoming videos as soon as they're uploaded. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, make sure to follow me there as well. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!